Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've heard some erudite and persuasive speeches from people with far more knowledge of the region than I do. And there seems little doubt that the House is going to support the motion tonight, which I strongly welcome, and I shall do the same. So I don't intend to try to persuade the House of the evils of ISIL or the need to do anything or the need to bomb. But I do just want to flag up three aspects that I think I hope the government will bear in mind. And I particularly welcome the speeches by my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, which as one would expect, covered the issues extremely well, and also my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield. And it's in that vein that actually we may need to do more that I want to speak very briefly. Firstly, the issue of the tremendous coalition involving so many other Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and others, which I'm sure we all strongly welcome. But I hope that the Deputy Prime Minister in his wind-up is going to be able to address the stories that are going around, that is a pretty lukewarm support from some of those countries, that indeed their participation in the strikes have been pretty small, and that indeed some accusations that they did a little more than just fly around. It would be useful to know precisely what their role is, but also to address the financial issue. It's all very well saying, well, they should stop buying the oil, but somehow there is a financial institutions and mechanism that is turning that oil into the flow of cash that is buying the weapons, etc., for ISIL. And I hope that pressure can be brought to deal through financial institutions with that. My second point relates to the Prime Minister's totally understandable commitment that we should not be putting British troops on the ground. I'm a firm believer that we should always retain some element of surprise, and that if you, to use a phrase that's already been used, if you will the end, you need to will the means. I don't want to see British troops on the ground, and I entirely agree that it's down to the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga to be the troops on the ground, to take back the ground that hopefully airstrikes will liberate. But nevertheless, I'm not sure that it is wise to rule out forever and a day, as I think we are doing, the issue of troops on the ground. My final point is Syria. I'm totally sure the Prime Minister will come back to this House about Syria. Indeed, I believe he should do. But before doing so, I do think he needs to address this fundamental question that I have. How do you attack ISIL in Syria without being seen as in some way supporting the Assad regime, when we're actually at the same time supporting the Free Syrian Army? And I think, I'm afraid there is still a small lacuna in policy, as I understand it, on that issue.
Mike Gapes.
Deputy Speaker, although its origins lie in Islamist jihadist groups in Iraq and elsewhere, ISIL is not an Islamic organisation, nor is it a state, and I think our media should stop referring to it in its self-description. And I'm glad that the motion does not use those words. I want to say 2 points in the very limited time that is available. This criminal caliphate cult, which is what it is a threat to all the communities in the region, and because of the 15,000 foreign fighters who have been attracted to it, including 3,000 European Union citizens, it is a threat to us. I have a very large number of Muslim constituents. I also, and I can't go any further, have people in my borough who have been arrested or detained or imprisoned for terrorist offences. And I believe it is vital that we do not take action which gives the narrative that we are against Islam. We are not. We are fighting to defend Islam and Muslims in the Middle East region and also in this country. And the worst crimes are being carried out against Islamic women by this brutal terrorist organisation. And finally, I'd like to say something about the Kurds. I'm pleased that the British government is now giving the support that it should have given earlier to the Kurdistan regional government when they requested military support. I am glad that we are seen by the Kurds as a friend. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he's right very much to raise the plight of the Kurds. And does he also agree that it's not just about military assistance, we have to get humanitarian assistance into the Kurds? There are hundreds of thousands of them fleeing both Syria and Kurdish-controlled Iraq too.
I went to the KRG last year. I visited the area of Dohuk and the Donetsk refugee camp. At that time, there were about 150,000 Syrian Kurdish refugees, half of them in the city of Dohuk, living with families, the other half in a very well organised refugee camp. Now, there are many more. There were 250,000 Syrian Kurds who fled last year. Now it is estimated that the KRG, with a population of about 4.5 million people, has got 1.4 million refugees or displaced people from the rest of Iraq. Similar stories apply in the other countries in the region, but the Kurds have taken in Christians, Yazidis, Sunnis, Shias, and they have not had any discrimination. They care about humanity. This is a functioning democratic society. It needs our support, it needs our investment, it needs our humanitarian assistance, and above all, the brave but lightly armed Peshmerga who've put themselves on the line need far more equipment and training. A few weeks ago, the capital city of the KRG, Erbil, was potentially going to be swept aside. The Americans and others were thinking about evacuating personnel. And it's only because of the Peshmerga's bravery that the KRG was kept safe. It's vital that ISIL is driven back, that they are defeated, and ultimately they will have to be eliminated, and that includes the ideology that they represent has to be challenged not just by us, but also from within the Muslim world, from the imams, from the various mosques, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt and elsewhere.
Yeah.
There can be and is no greater responsibility for Parliament than when committing troops, combat troops, armed forces to battle. And as such, we are absolutely right to scrutinise, to examine the evidence, and to ask the questions. But I'm afraid that there are certain questions that remain unanswered, and I do hope that the Deputy Prime Minister will address these issues when he winds up the debate. One of the key concerns is that there seems to be a lack of a coordinated plan, particularly when it comes to the military and political aspects of it. As a soldier, clarity of mission, a clear exit strategy was absolutely essential. And yet what we seem to have here is a situation where we all accept that military intervention, airstrikes alone, will not defeat IS. But what isn't clear is what is plan B if there are no ground forces to follow through and take and hold ground. And I'm talking about local and regional ground forces. Because there is a real danger here that if the Iraqi army is not fit for purpose and cannot take and hold ground, then actually the airstrikes themselves not only become ineffective, but actually become counterproductive, especially if civilian casualties mount, and especially if, in being ineffective, they become counterproductive, because IS will be able to spin that they've withstood the might of the West and held ground. And there is a real danger here, without a coordinated military plan, that we're going to go up a cul-de-sac with no successful exit strategy. But I also suggest the politics are not right. It is very clear that one of the major reasons for IS's success in the north of the country is because the Sunni minorities feel alienated. We've had a change in leadership. The sectarian al-Maliki has gone, but the next tier of politicians that were responsible for actually implementing that sectarian politics have largely remained in place. There has been no clear out, and without a political solution, without the hearts and minds accompanying a military campaign, then actually any military successes on the ground could be very well short-lived. Given the past errors in the past, with regards to just knocking the door down, then in effect walking away, we've got to learn from these past errors. Because if we don't, we're going to yet again make fundamental errors.
Jamie Reid.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'll be brief. I support the motion before us tonight, and I commend both the case made by the Prime Minister and the excellent case of support made by the Leader of the Opposition. There's been a great deal of unanimity in the comments and contributions from across the House so far, but I do have some concerns, like the Right Honourable Gentleman, about the debate so far, and I hope that the Deputy Prime Minister, when he concludes the debate, will be able to address those. First of all, we have to be absolutely clear with the British people. Our support for intervention is morally and strategically and politically right, but we have to be clear. We do not fully know how this will end. As is usually the case, this plan will not survive contact with the enemy. We need to be frank about that. Frank, too, about the potential consequences. We must never again see soft and hard power as separate strategies. The lesson of the 21st century has been that hard power without soft power is disastrous, and that soft power without the prospect of hard power is too often pointless. Nobody in this House wants to write a blank cheque, morally, strategically or financially. The motion seeks to avoid this, but the motion will not be on the battlefield. Mr Deputy Speaker, we will be back to these issues before the general election, I am sure, to discuss these issues again, perhaps with regard to further intervention, and that's the truth. And when the Deputy Prime Minister concludes, I hope he'll be able to tell us what assessment the government has made regarding the potential domestic consequences of our intervention. The public would expect that, and surely some assessment has been undergone. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, were I a Muslim Briton, I would feel under siege in my own country, marginalised, treated with suspicion, caution, even contempt, for many years now than I would care to remember. And as a Parliament and as a legislature, we need to do more to reach out to our Muslim countrymen. We have to let them know that the extremism we are fighting against is as alien to them as it is to everyone else in this country. We don't do this enough, and I hope that when he concludes, that the Deputy Prime Minister will ensure that this is done and that he will make this point when he concludes the debate. I support the motion before us, but it deliberately avoids a series of difficult questions which demand some extremely difficult answers. We will, I am certain, return to these issues very soon, but fundamentally we must deal with the world as it is and not how we would like it to be.
Graham.
Mr Deputy Speaker, there have been many good speeches today, some at different volumes, and I only wish to contribute three main points. Firstly, on the justification of military action, secondly, on the question of ISIL and Islam, and thirdly, on the longer-term plan. On the first point, I've always believed there are only two ways to justify military action. The first is self-defence, and the second is protecting other states in their self-defence. In the case of this motion, there is both self-defence, citizens have already been captured and executed, and there is also the Iraqi government's request for our help in protecting their state against this brutal invasion. On the second point of ISIL and Islam, it is incredibly important for the cohesion of our country that no one confuses the action we're taking against ISIL with our views on Islam. And today, the leaders of the Muslim community in Gloucester, in my constituency, have published a letter in The Citizen which highlights their views, that the Muslim communities in Gloucester today together speak out over the evils of terrorism and condemn the horrific atrocities falsely committed in the name of Islam in Iraq and Syria. This is important, Mr Deputy Speaker, because as both President Obama and our own Prime Minister have stressed, we should be working with Muslim communities and not allowing this legal action to become a wedge between them and the rest of us. And I hope the Deputy Prime Minister will agree with me that there is more to be done on this on both sides. Lastly then, on the plan ahead, the motion today is quite clear that our action is to support the government of Iraq in protecting civilians and restoring its territorial integrity. That is enough for now, for me, Mr Deputy Speaker, And I believe very strongly, in answer to the question, should we be sending tornadoes everywhere in the world where barbarous terrorists strike, the answer to that is, as the Leader of the House, then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond, once said, just because we cannot interfere everywhere does not mean we should never intervene anywhere. And we do so today in a coalition of regional countries and 2 other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council at the specific request of the government of Iraq. But looking ahead, there is no doubt, and other members have reflected this, that there will be a significant effort required to bring about the great quotation from Ban Ki-moon that the Prime Minister repeated today, the strength of governance defeating terrorism. And there's a huge amount of work to be done on that. And as my guide to the causes of war, the historian Sir Michael Howard once wrote, force or the threat of it may not settle arguments, but it does play a considerable part in determining the structure of the world in which we live. Let us hope, therefore, in supporting the motion today, that the action we take will help bring about a structure in Iraq in which all peoples can work together peacefully.
Yeah. Fourthly, this motion is the thin end of a bloody and ugly wedge that will grow and expand and mission creep into a prolonged war with unforeseeable consequences. We're falling into a vortex in the Middle East of hatreds that are ancient and deep, and once we start this process, it will be almost impossible in the future to extricate ourselves from it. We talk under various delusions. One is the feeling of omnipotence, that our presence is absolutely essential. We do have a presence, we do have a contribution to make, but we were told during the Gulf War that we had to go in 2003, otherwise Saddam Hussein would continue. That wasn't the case. The Americans were already there. The Americans are there. To our great gratitude, they're there now. And they are a country that sacrificed more of their sons and daughters seeking democracy for the people of other countries than any other land in the world. But we should look at our own policies. Why can't we become independent in our foreign policy? We haven't since the time of Vietnam, because there's a terrible prospect for us, and it's happening now. With the result of the war in Iraq was to deepen that sense of suspicion, alienation between the Western Christian communities and the Eastern Muslim communities. At that time, when we went in 2003, it was just a minority involved in Al-Qaeda. They hardly figured at all. Now we find, to our horror, that young children who've been born here, brought up here, absorbed our values in education, are suddenly, in their adolescent years, having their idealism twisted and marching off to behave like medieval barbarians. How on earth has this happened? And it's happened not from the mosques, the imams who are not very much in touch with them. It's happened from the internet and from the propaganda that's coming from them. That's the source of that evil. And once people become radicalized in this way, when they lose all their standards of common humanity, which they're doing in ISIL now, there's no question they'll come back here. We're in a world of a war in which on one side there are marvellous weapons, sophisticated, clever weapons, but you don't need those to fight a terrorist activity. You didn't need a nuclear weapon to bring down the Twin Towers. You didn't need a smart bomb to murder a soldier on the streets of Britain. And in this asymmetric warfare, there is no military solution. The solution will bring its own consequences in more terror. And I believe we have to look to have an independent foreign policy free from the United States.
Nadim Zahawi.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I draw the House's attention to my register of members' interest. I'm co-chairman of the All-Party Group for Kurdistan and vice-chairman of the All-Party Group for Iraq. There is no forgetting that over the past 2 decades, the United Kingdom has spent a total of 16 years at war in Iraq, nor the profound effect it has had on our national psyche. It is, I'm sure, the source of hesitation some right honourable members will be feeling today. ISIL is a contagion, and I think we are right to join our coalition partners in airstrikes. Effectively targeting airstrikes to degrade ISIL's warfighting capabilities and dismantle their command and control structures will do much, but we must not be lulled into the sense that they will provide a clinical, clear-cut victory alone. They can only be one aspect of an overall strategy. Intervention is complicated, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Its results unpredictable. We only have to look to Libya to see that. But it's impossible to mitigate all of the dangers. Instead, we have to take the long view. Fundamentally, this is a conflict management situation. It is not about bringing a decisive end to the endemic disorder the region has faced over the past century.
Give way. On that point, is not the endemic disorder that the region has faced partly a result of the borders imposed by the West 100 years ago? And is it obvious, as many people seem to think it is, that the current borders of the nation-state of Iraq are the right way to go?
Well, my honourable friend raises an important point. The Kurds have given themselves 3 months to see whether this new unity government will actually work. Of course, we have to be aware that our strategy relies on the actions of others, and we must be prepared to actively contend both with sudden changes in regional dynamics and evolving long-term agendas. Will Turkey come off the fence and offer a definitive contribution? Will Saudi clerics make the ideological and religious arguments necessary to counter this violent extremism? Are Qatar and Kuwait ready to stop the flow of funds to ISIL? And to what extent can Iran be relied upon to act pragmatically? By linking nuclear negotiations to actions on ISIL, they endanger a backlash from both Riyadh and, of course, Tel Aviv, and potentially compromise any shared gains. Fundamentally, can the Iraqi government introduce the changes in quality and equality of governance required? Are they prepared to introduce a new form of federalism? Honesty and equity on revenue sharing, meaningful economic reform, and settle outstanding constitutional questions. Such intertwined forces will require creative thinking by our diplomats. My honourable friend, the member for Penrith and the Borders, pointed out very clearly what we need to do to resource those diplomats. And, of course, they need to consider all the options that are open to them. Events that the current Grand Coalition, just in putting it together, what if it doesn't become workable? What if it doesn't work? What are plan Bs? In Washington, our colleagues are beginning to think about those options, and we must do too. The choice between boots on the ground and heads in the sand is a false dichotomy, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Destroying ISIL is something only the people of the region can accomplish. But if we can buy them some time and space to do that, then I think we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll be supporting the motion today. We're right to demand a coherent and an effective strategy, but on the bigger issue of whether to act at all, the question I ask is this. If we're not prepared to take on monsters like these when they threaten our citizens, our interests and our entire value system, when we accept that there can be no accommodation with them at all, then when exactly would we be prepared to act? I respect the Prime Minister for being clear today that this campaign may last several years. We must authorise action in the knowledge of the lives, military and civilian, that may be lost. But it is right that we strike now, at a time when the extremists have made great advances but do not yet have the secure foothold in the region that they need. They control Iraq's second city, but not yet the full apparatus of statehood. We should recognise the legacy of the botched vote on Syria last year. I know that there are different views on this, but for my part, the failure of resolve from the US and the UK did not magically trigger this chemical weapon breakthrough, as some suggest. It emboldened extremists by showing them that the bar for action against their terror was that much higher. And we must dispel confusion about the forces fighting in Syria. It's demeaning and wrong to hear people say that last year we were being asked to intervene on the side of ISIL. The moderate democratic Syrian opposition coalition were desperate for help in their two-fronted battle against a murderous dictator on one side and the evil jihadis on the other. They're now beaten back, but they are not cowed, and their forces will play an important part in degrading ISIL within Syria if we can give them support from airstrikes. So it's time for all sides on this debate to match laudable rhetoric with commitment. If we believe that the world must pursue ISIL until it is defeated, if we accept the legal case, if we support the action of other nations who are operating in the country, and if we think it is morally wrong, as has been powerfully expressed today, for us to sit on the sidelines while others confront this evil, then we must state our ambition now to put forward a strategy for action inside Syria too.
For two-thirds of my adult lifetime, we've been dropping bombs on Iraq. And as the member for Bradford West said in his contribution, actually, we've been doing it for 100 years. Each time we do it, we think it's going to make things better. The evidence suggests that each time we do it, we make things worse. I voted against the Iraq war in 2003 because I thought it would make things worse, as did the... No, he wasn't in Parliament at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister, I'm sorry. But many Liberal Democrats did vote against it, and they were right, it did make things worse. The Leader of the Opposition countered the idea that if we countered the argument that if we do anything will make things worse by saying, and I quote him, if we pass by, we will make it harder to persuade Arab countries to play their part. I find that quite a difficult argument to understand. The House Commons Library tells me that of the top 18 Muslim countries in the world, of which 13 are Arab and the other 5 are Muslim countries such as Pakistan and Indonesia, there are 2.8 million men under arms, 2.8 million soldiers. It seems to me that if there are Muslims being threatened, fellow Muslims, co-religionists in this part of Iraq and Syria, the first response would be from Muslim countries. That those top 18 Muslim countries, and maybe many others as well, would be the first to put their soldiers' lives on the line. Not necessarily all of them, and of course they wouldn't all today be available. But I think that out of 2.8 million soldiers, you could probably find enough to do the job, especially if you could find other countries, including those in the West and in the Gulf, to pay for them. And they would not excite the natural suspicion and antagonism which will be aroused by any involvement by the West. But that hasn't happened yet. I think probably the single most important contribution I've heard was from the member for Oldham West, who said there are big questions to ask about the regional powers who have been supporting ISIL. This has hardly been touched upon in this debate. We've heard that Turkey hasn't made up its mind yet. There are big concerns that some of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia itself are partly supporting ISIL. The truth of the matter is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we face with the current situation, Islam faces its own version of the 30 Years' War. The idea that we can solve the problem by supporting one side in this war is absolutely delusional. It is only Muslims who can decide locally for themselves whether they wish to live together or to die together. And as far as the United Nations is concerned, I think there is a role for the United Nations and the 5 permanent members, including Russia and China. And I think it's quite possible we could get a resolution through, including all 5 members, if we but tried.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, when it comes to this military intervention in the Middle East, you don't have to look in the crystal ball. You can read the book. And it's because I'm all too familiar with the history of our last military intervention in this region that I will not be supporting this motion in the lobbies tonight. But let me say, it is totally disingenuous of colleagues on either side to say it is a choice between acting and not acting. It is a choice between what sort of action you take, whether you place the emphasis on what in some ways are these military interventions which are in some ways for show, or whether you put the emphasis on the humanitarian work, the diplomatic work, and above all, in putting pressure on the great powers in the region to step up. And there's something that no one has mentioned. It is quite clear from what ISIL has done, filming these beheadings, putting them on YouTube, making sure they have English voiceovers, that they are seeking to incite us to bomb. And why doesn't that give people pause that this is something they want? Because it will make them the heroic Muslim defenders against the Crusaders. It's been said, and I don't need to repeat it, that airstrikes on their own will not win a war against ISIL. You will need ground forces. We know the Iraqi army is wholly inadequate. Inevitably, we're going to get drawn into Syria. The Prime Minister's admitted as much and has even said that he would wrap it up by saying he was doing it on humanitarian grounds. What I haven't heard much about is the issue around Turkey and the Kurds. I have one of the largest Turkish-Kurdish communities in the country in northeast London, and I know that the Kurdish community has a long-held aspiration for a Kurdish state, which I support, but it would involve dismembering Syria and Turkey and Iraq. And I think that explains some of Turkey's ambivalence about this issue. Some people have said this isn't 2003. Sadly, this reminds me too much of 2003. Yes, it's legal, but I hear the same rhetoric. National interest, surgical strikes, populations begging to be liberated. It was Walpole, I think, who said of another war that the population are ringing the bells today, but they'll be wringing their hands tomorrow. We know that the public wants something to be done, but as this war wears on, and as it drains us of millions and billions of pounds, the public will be saying, what are we doing there and how are we going to get out? I cannot support this military intervention. I do not see the strategy and I do not see the end game.
Mark Reckless.
Surely humility and modesty should be our watchwords in this debate, if only because the reductions we've made to the size of our armed forces across the Army, Navy, and I'm afraid also Air Force are so significant, yet we don't seem to have made the same reduction in our leading politicians' desire to intervene across the world with the relatively modest armed forces we still have. I'm pleased that in this debate there's been quite a strongly pro-American tone, I believe, both from the left and the right, and I think President Obama has found the words to describe very impressively what they are trying to do, and I wish them enormously well in that. But it is the case that the size of their forces and ability to intervene is one, if not two, orders of magnitude bigger than our own. And I think we also need to think about our own record in previous debates. It's only a year ago that we were debating a government motion to go in and bomb the other side in Syria. It's only 3 years ago that 557 honourable members across this House voted for the intervention in Libya. Now, it's very difficult to say whether anything is better in Libya as a result, because it's so dangerous people can't tell us what's going on there, which suggests the answer may not be the one we would wish. A week or two ago, I went to Calais and met hundreds, there were thousands, but the people I met, one gentleman, Peter, he had come from Ethiopia through Sudan and then through Libya to Lampedusa and was then sort of moved on by the Italians and just left at Bologna to get a train to Paris and then to Calais. And one thing, at least, that the Gaddafi didn't do was encourage these boats and had an agreement with Italy, and they, at that point, defended their borders, and it hasn't helped us the change we've had. In Iraq, we talk of this legitimate democratic government, but we have pretty much a sectarian Shia government, a little less than half, perhaps, of people voting for those type of parties, supported by about a fifth of the country for the Kurdish parties, who are happy to support that Shia regime as long as they pretty much run things in Kurdistan. And then we have a fifth of the country, the Sunnis, who are disengaged, to put it its mildest, from that process. And the reason we have this problem is because they prefer ISIL, or at least many of them do to one degree or another, to the Shia sectarian government that was either persecuting them or just not giving them any share of the spoils in that state. And some people in this House, Honourable Member for Neath is one, Honourable Member for New Forest West, have said that they regret their vote on the Iraq war in 2003. But I just don't understand what the Prime Minister's position is. And I would feel perhaps more prepared to support the government on this if I knew, does the Prime Minister think he made a mistake in 2003? Does he regret that vote, given what has happened? Or is it something from which he does not resile? I think an answer to that would help, and I believe we need to be modest and humble in our decision today.
Jeffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As my leader has indicated, we will be supporting the motion today. We wish our armed forces well in the actions that they will be required to take. And like many right honourable and honourable members in this House, this is not the first time that I've been called upon to vote on whether we should be going to war. And I have to say that looking at the past experiences, we would be really challenged to fault the actions of our armed forces in carrying out the demands that we have made of them. And I think the problem, as we look back on some of the conflicts we've been involved in, is how we've handled the politics afterwards and how we've gone about preventing further conflict in the future. Of course.
It was Theodore Roosevelt who was saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The West spoke softly whenever ISIS crossed across the front of Iraq. They also spoke softly when 100,000 Christians were expelled from Mosul with convert or die ultimatum. Does the honourable member feel that there only is one option now, and that is to carry the big stick and to wield it through military intervention?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do think that military intervention in Iraq on this occasion in support of the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga is justified. But how often are we going to be in this situation again? We have a review of the Strategic Defence and Security Review, which I believe is scheduled for next year. Shouldn't we be beginning that review now, in light of all that's happening in the world today, in light of the downsizing of our armed forces, in light of our capacity to respond to the situations that we are constantly faced now with on a regular basis? And what if another front opens up? What is our capacity to deal with that situation? And of course, as others have said so rightly, mission creep is a concern when you enter into a conflict that doesn't have an end date and a timescale with any degree of certainty. So I think that we need to be looking at SDSR urgently and whether we are on the right trajectory in terms of where our armed forces are and the strength of those armed forces and their capacity to deal with the situations that confront us. The politics, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think in Iraq clearly there are huge problems. And just appointing a new Prime Minister will not fix those problems in and of themselves. The sectarian issues that are familiar to us coming from Northern Ireland run deep in Iraq. And of course the Kurdish situation as well. And as it happens, the Northern Ireland Executive has a relationship with the Kurdish regional government through a memorandum of understanding, and we've been working closely with them. And I think actually, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is more that we could be doing to help the Kurdish improve their governance arrangements in Iraq, and indeed the Iraqi government itself. Too often when our armed forces leave the battlefield, we do not do enough to invest in the new politics that's required to bring the transformation post-conflict in those situations. So I think that we need to put more emphasis on the politics in the future. The Right Honourable Member for North East Bedfordshire, I think, was absolutely right when he said that we need to look at how we can counter this violent extremism. That means countering the narrative that they have, not just here in the United Kingdom. And we need to look at strategies like Prevent. Are we doing enough here in the UK to counter the radicalism that exists? Arresting those who we believe and are suspicious of their involvement in preparing for acts of terrorism is one thing, but getting to the root cause and the source of that radicalism is something else, and we need to consider that. But also we need to be helping the Arab nations to counter the extremism. There is an opportunity, given our involvement in this conflict, to get alongside some of our Arab partners and to work with them to counter the extremism and to create a narrative that is more effective than the one that exists at present.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, what is taking place in Iraq and Syria today is not just an attack on our society and way of life. Such barbarism is an attack on humanity itself. The Prime Minister is right. Britain must play its part in defeating this evil. Throughout history, we in these islands, and indeed the entire English-speaking world, have stood firm against aggression in defence of freedom, and so must we again. The barbaric and cruel persecution of minority groups, especially the Yazidis, Christians, and indeed Muslims, we are witnessing has no place in the world that we live today. The United Kingdom has unique military capabilities which should be extended to preserve the lives of innocent civilians and ultimately protect the lives of British people. Whilst it is right that the United Kingdom should provide humanitarian aid, this must be consolidated with steadfast military support, including providing Kurdish ground forces with suitable resources and delivering airstrikes against ISIL. Certainly.
I thought in a very giving way. Would you agree with me and share my alarm that the territory which ISIS now control is actually greater than that of the United Kingdom?
Indeed, my honourable friend is absolutely correct, which is why we have to consider taking action in Syria as well as the Iraqi area which ISIL control. The Royal Air Force should be there alongside our allies in the United States, Australia and others, leading the fight to crush those who seek to inflict such cruelty and wickedness on the people of the Middle East. But as the Prime Minister has said, this is also about protecting our people too, and protecting the streets of Britain. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is not a fight which we can win alone. Other nations, particularly those from the Muslim and Arabic countries, must play their part too. We have a global duty to stand together, and every nation dedicated to the cause of humanity must play its part. Walking by on the other side of the road is not an option for any nation in these tragic circumstances. But we must also be uncompromising in guarding our own country and our own people. Whatever action is necessary to protect the safety and security of the British people must be taken. It is right that the United Kingdom plays an integral role in building a coalition of nations from across the world who are prepared to stand up to extremist Islamism. Whilst British action has the full support of Iraq's government, we must also recognise that there is now no border between Iraq and Syria, and if battle needs to be taken there too, then so be it. Certainly.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I'm sure he's aware that RAF Akrotiri is only 100 miles from the Syrian border. Would he join with me in reinforcing the importance of keeping safe all the dependents and the families who live at RAF Akrotiri and commend them for the role they play?
I entirely support my right honourable friend on what she has said. Indeed, RAF Akrotiri is a British sovereign base, an overseas territory, an important overseas territory that we of course use in such conflicts, and the people there must also be protected and looked after. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is many contributions today that have played an important part in the discussions on this issue, but there is, I believe, no finer words that I could quote today to sum up the situation that we now face and the decision that we in this UK Parliament must take today. The words spoken by Margaret Thatcher on the 22nd of November 1990, when she said to this House that those who have never had to take such decisions, I say that they are taken with a heavy heart and in the knowledge of manifold dangers, but with tremendous pride and professionalism and courage in our armed forces. There is a sense of this country's destiny, the centuries of history and experience which ensure that when principles have to be defended, when good has to be upheld, and when evil has to be overcome, Britain will take up arms.
Anderson. Robert Flannel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I just briefly seek your guidance. There are a number of honourable members who have been in the chamber since 10:30 who are probably not going to get called. There are a number of members coming into the chamber now who have not been here all day who are making interventions. Can we have a ruling on that?
The ruling is it's not even a point of order. David Anderson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, I led a trade union delegation to Kurdistan, and I was amazed by the reaction of those people who were delighted that our country had invaded that the United Nations, and since I've learned why that was so. Because those people in Kurdistan had lived through a period when they'd seen genocide in Halabja, 182,000 people destroyed by Saddam Hussein, 4,500 villages razed to the ground, while the West, including the government led by Margaret Thatcher, turned its back. While 1 million Iraqis and Iranians were being killed on the battlefield, the West turned its back because it was a price worth paying, because Saddam was keeping the Ayatollah occupied. So, for me to take a position today, I went back to those people and said, what do you think we should be doing in this House today? And the advice I've received from a very close comrade of mine on the ground in the trade union movement in Kurdistan is this. ISIS is a fascist organisation. The only language it understands is force. Under them, trade unions have been, as under Saddam, forced to go back underground. Despite recent elections, Iraq is still terribly divided, but the immediate threat of ISIS must be halted, and to do that we need external military air support. Very, very clear advice to the people at the sharp end, not us in the cosset areas, not the intelligence services. And we've learnt lessons. Things are different today, but I do want to say very, very clear to the Prime Minister, if this is going to be escalated, under no circumstances should it be escalated without us coming back together. I don't care what he says about certain instances might mean he's got to act on his own. He should not do that. That's one of the main reasons why this House was held in such contempt. I'm also very, very wary about who the Prime Minister is being advised by. Yesterday in the United Nations, the Iranian President said certain intelligence agencies have put blades in the hands of madmen, and included in those intelligence agencies who were behind the build-up of ISIS, some people will claim were the CIA and Mossad, because their intention was, after the failure last year to take action on Syria, they'd find another way of making people like us take action and support action. Now, that may not be correct, but unless that sort of thing is addressed, the people in this country will have those suspicions that this could well be a backdoor to take action in Syria. So whatever we do today, I believe, in supporting the people on the ground in Kurdistan, I have to support this action, even though I don't really want to, but I'm very, very clear that the Prime Minister should do nothing without the sanction of this House.
Joe Benton. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I understood him right, the Honourable Member for Islington North suggested that many people in this House were perhaps taking this decision lightly. If that is what he said, can I say how wrong he is? Yeah. I don't believe we've had a better debate, more thoughtful interventions from all sides of the House, and I, for one, believe that my generation of members of this House, the well of military intervention is well and truly poisoned by previous interventions, and our default position is not to blindly go by what the front bench might say on this. I am going to support the government on this for the very good reasons that were put forward by the Prime Minister, and I have to say the Leader of the Opposition as well, putting forward a very eloquent case. I think we should be mindful tonight of the people of Kobani. My honourable friend, the member for Stratford-on-Avon, has just told me that this is a town. OK, it's in Syria, but it should be in part of our mind tonight, because it is surrounded, genocide is taking place, there is an existential threat to the community living there, and that is not an exception in that region. This is a very important decision we take tonight. My right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, put, I thought, the most clear and the most powerful case for a coherent plan. And what we are talking about tonight is a short-term plan. This will resolve a short-term issue. The medium-term plan must be to see the Sunni tribes and the Iraqi and Kurdish forces prevail against ISIS and some level of normality return to those communities. But the long-term plan must see an outcome which is something that perhaps we can only dream of. The sort of good governance that Ban Ki-moon has been talking about. The ejection of ISIL to the fringes of our minds and to the reality of people's lives in the region. But to get there, we have to be absolutely resolute. We have to see the kind of work happening in Whitehall as is currently happening in places like Washington. The concerns raised by my honourable friend for Penrith and the borders in a previous debate about the decimation of the thinking that has happened over the last 25 years in organisations like the Foreign Office. We want to see that reversed. In the last seconds I have left, I would just say that I'm very pleased in the motion. It talks about the threat to ourselves, to this country. We mustn't forget that ISIL leaders have extolled their members to go back and cause terrorism incidents here. I represent a constituency where many thousands of people travel to London every day. They get on the tube, as they did on the 7th of July 2005. We have a duty to them, and we have a duty to all the British subjects who trade around the world, who are at risk from the kind of kidnapping and extortion that this evil force is doing around the world, to support this motion tonight.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to make a few short remarks following the learned contributions of other honourable members. This is not an easy debate nor an easy decision. Nobody wants to be part of the process of war. However, ISIL represent little but the tools of ego and hate. There is no love, no compassion, no element of progress or development. There is only destruction and power, the violation of women and the murder of whole communities, whether Christian, Yazidi, Muslim. This battle is not against Islam, it is in defence of Islam. ISIL needs to be stopped. In Iraq, in Syria, by their own governments and with international support as needed. In an ideal world, that would be through negotiations, and if the difference was genuinely a political one, it would be possible. The problem is that the behaviour of ISIL is not subject to negotiation. It is a cancer that will spread as far as the world will allow it. Standing back is not an option if we believe that humanity is worth fighting for and protecting. To do nothing is to abdicate responsibility and let ISIL get away with their barbarism. I have come to the view that we need to play our part in a coalition to support airstrikes, but I see no appetite for our boots on the ground. ISIS is a huge threat to the stability of Iraq, the wider region, and airstrikes have so far been successful in limiting their advance. The action has the support of other Arab nations and is a product of assistance directly requested by the Iraqi government. My biggest concern, however, is the lack of a coherent strategy alongside the international coalition's military action. I hope that in the Minister's wind-up we can hear more of an active political dialogue led by Arab nations to put aside their differences, genuinely share responsibility for handling the crisis, join up humanitarian support and plan for a sustainable peace. The world needs Arab nations to stand up in unity, to tackle comprehensively the funding and support that ISIL receives, and to lead this campaign for ISIL's defeat and for the long-term peace. Any action we take must not create a vacuum that sees any new instability emerge. For those who say it is not our battle, I want to say this, that it is a fight for the whole world. However, any action must also be subject to close scrutiny, and I hope this House will take its part seriously in that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was in February 2002 that I went on the famous march in London with estimated millions of people around the world. My now wife came on her first ever political protest. And I was proud to be part of that movement, and proud now that so many in this House have acknowledged that my colleagues on the Liberal Democrat benches were right to oppose it. But this situation could not be more different. We now have a democratic sovereign state that has asked us for help to deal with one of the most unpleasant terrorist forces that we have ever seen. There is a clear legal case for action, and there is an overwhelming moral case not to simply sit and watch the appalling scenes that we have seen on the television. And we also have a nation now, and I'm pleased many honourable members have acknowledged that, to accept that we have a responsibility precisely because of the mistake of going into Iraq in the first place. I will, of course, give way.
I thank him for giving way. He said we had a moral obligation because Iraq was a democratic state. Could he tell the House why is it a democratic state?
I think this is a very strange time to be seeking to make points about the mistaken invasion into Iraq. And I think he should instead accept some of that responsibility for the vote that he made that was so mistaken. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I am also pleased that this House is taking so seriously its most profound responsibility, which is when we have to vote to send our brave servicemen and women to war. And I take that as seriously as anyone, having been up to nearly 20,000 feet with 3 very brave former and current servicemen who have served and been injured fighting for our country. I have seen at first hand the reality of what that means through the incredible work of the Royal British Legion Battleback Centre, and we are right to take this seriously. But it would be a further tragedy of the disaster of the invasion into Iraq in 2003 if we felt we were unable ever again to intervene as part of an international force, which is what this is. This is not simply following America's coattails. This is part of a genuine international coalition, and we must do this. We simply cannot turn a blind eye to genocide, to ethnic cleansing, to the most appalling sorts of religious persecution we have seen since, frankly, the concentration camps. Then it was an attempt to wipe out the Jewish people and the Jewish faith, as well as Poles, Catholics, Socialists, Gypsies. Now it's Christians, it's Muslims of both Sunni and Shia and Yazidis, and people of all faiths and none being slaughtered, murdered, tortured. The BBC reporting that 3,000 women and children sold into the sex slave by people who claim to be doing this on the behalf of religion. And I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have heard nothing today from those. And I understand we all have anxieties, and we should. But I have heard nothing from those who are voting no or telling us to vote no as to say what the alternative is here. And you cannot negotiate with an evil maniacal force like Islamic State, and we should not. We must stop that, and then we will be assisting a further opportunity for the Middle East to go forward again. Mr. Deputy Speaker, like everyone else, I will be taking this vote seriously and with heavy heart, but as an internationalist and as a Liberal and as someone who believes that this country should not turn its back on what is happening now, I feel this country has to take a part in this international coalition, and I will be voting support the motion this evening.
Madeleine Moon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are things that we agree on. We agree that action is legal. We agree that ISIL is un-Islamic, barbarous and evil, whose violent and horrific behaviour towards captives and opposition forces has horrified the world. We are voting today for 6 planes to fly missions to weaken ISIS on the ground and to leave it to local forces to undertake ground attacks. Now, I then start to have some concerns, because who's going to do that work on the ground? That's where I have my major concerns. Who are going to provide the people who will undertake that work? For terrorism to thrive, you need 3 things. You need men, money, and an ideology that will attract the other 2. Sadly, a lot of the money and the men and the ideology have come from those nations that we now are going to call our allies, and who we are going to rely upon to fly missions with us and to take the work onto the ground. I am concerned that British forces are going to be increasingly dragged in to undertaking that work. And I will hope that we will hear from the Deputy Prime Minister what guarantees we're going to have that our Arab allies are actually going to take part in this fight, that the NATO forces are not going to be a smokescreen behind which their inactivity is hidden, and where they show to their people that they are taking part. We're told that there is no military solution. There is only a political solution. For me, a political solution would be a federalist Iraq, a future where there is a Kurdistan, Sunnistan and Shiistan working together. Unless we give the Sunni population something to fight for, they will not engage. After all, they have been attacked with barrel bombs, they've been subject to murder by the regime in Baghdad. They have taken to ISIS because ISIS has actually been better than the Baghdadi government. In conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I just want to say a few words to thank the lady from Ecclesall and Salford for her kind words in relation to the British hostages, because we've got to bear in mind those two people who are living in fear of their lives while we have this debate today. All of our thoughts have got to be with them. And just finally, can I hear that we will be taking on also the Khorasan group, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate who are also a major threat in this country, and also the Ba'athist Naqshbandi organisation, which is also a particularly nasty organisation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 6 hours and many very good contributions to the substance of this debate, I want, if I may, to consider the wider constitutional position that we are placed in. Over the past decade or two, a convention has started to develop that, except in an emergency, major foreign policy interventions must be pre-approved by a vote in Parliament. This idea springs from honourable motives, and it is understandable given the present climate of distrust in politics. But in my judgment, I would like to submit it is nevertheless a serious mistake. It is absolutely right for Parliament to insist on proper democratic accountability where military action is at stake, through debates, through questions and statements. But the requirement for a prior authorising vote of this House is something very different. Yes, it is vital for parliamentarians to maintain the most unreserved communication with their constituents on this, as indeed on any matter of public importance. But the plain fact is that in matters of foreign policy, with a few signal exceptions, members of this House are inevitably far less well informed than ministers who follow and reflect upon these issues every day. We do not have access, the same access to officials and advisers, we are not privy to diplomatic traffic or secret intelligence, we are not briefed by and may not demand briefings from our armed forces. As a large corporate body, we lack the capacity to react quickly and without warning to fast-changing events. The result is delay and a loss of agility and surprise, which ill serves our forces in the field. I will not give way. There is no time, I'm afraid, sir. Not only that, I would suggest that as a matter of fundamental constitutional principle, extreme care should be exercised as to when or whether this House is asked to vote on these matters in future. It is a basic purpose of Parliament, and above all of this chamber, to hold the government to account for its actions. It is for the government, with all its advantages of preparation, information, advice and timeliness, to act. It is then for Parliament, for this chamber, to scrutinise that action. But if instead Parliament itself authorises such action in advance, what then? It gives up part of its power of scrutiny. It binds members in their own minds rather than allowing them the opportunity to assess each government decision on its own merits and in the circumstances. And instead of being forced to explain and justify their actions, ministers can always take final refuge by saying, well, you authorised it. Thus, far from strengthening Parliament, it weakens the government, it weakens the dynamic tension between the two sides, the tension from which proper accountability and effective policy must derive. Mr. Speaker, on the 3rd of April 1982, this House was recalled by Mrs. Thatcher for the Falklands War debate. It was a Saturday, the first time the House had been so recalled since Suez. Tempers were high, the atmosphere was one of crisis, the task force was about to sail. It was a matter of peace or war. The very sovereignty of this nation was at stake. Yet what was the motion that day? That this House do now adjourn. When the government comes to reflect on these proceedings in calmer days, I hope it will heed the wisdom in that.
At this late hour, I won't repeat any of the arguments that have been made earlier in the debate. I will be voting for the motion this evening, and there are just 2 points I would like to make which I don't think have been fully covered so far. In his contribution, the Prime Minister said that it might be necessary to take the fight against ISIL into Syria. I think that probably will be necessary at some stage. He said that it might not be possible for him to seek authority from this House before doing so. He undoubtedly has taken legal advice about whether such action would be in accord with international law. And I ask the Prime Minister to put a summary of that advice before the House at the earliest possible date, and to share full copies of the legal advice, both in relation to action in Iraq and action in Syria on Privy Council terms with members of the front bench opposite. The second point I'd make, Mr. Speaker, is this. Our country's security depends on the doctrine of collective security provided through NATO. The summit in Wales discussed ISIL and concluded, and I quote in their communique, that ISIL poses a grave threat to the Iraqi people, the Syrian people, to the wider region and to our nations. And it pledged that if the security of any ally is threatened, we will not hesitate to take all necessary steps to ensure our collective defence. I believe that we can't opt out of that commitment given in Wales. We must, as the United Kingdom, bear our part of the collective burden. I couldn't hold up my head in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly if our country were to duck out and to leave it to the United States, France and our Arab partners to deal with this very difficult problem. We need to contribute to global security, not be a passive consumer of security provided by others. Now, the decision about whether to go to war, when it comes before this House, is always one of the most difficult and serious decisions that we as elected members of Parliament have to make. There's rarely a right answer about what we should do in such circumstances. What we need to do is to look for what is the least worst option. And I believe that engaging militarily, though ugly, is necessary, and I urge members to vote for the motion tonight.
Simon Reevell.
Mr. Speaker, I'll reduce significantly what I was going to say to the content of an email that I was sent by two constituents who live in a small village called Shelley. They'd sat up and talked about this situation because they realised the seriousness of the prospect of war. They'd had on their minds the civilian casualties that may follow, and they'd had very much the dire consequences that there may be for hostages if this country takes part in airstrikes. But what they said encapsulates why I will support this motion. They said this: there comes a time when it's paramount for the collective to defend citizens of other nations whose governments can't defend them. There's also a need to show that as a country we're prepared to defend our own citizens.
Mr. Barry Gardner.
This motion is the result of our failure to develop a sustained, coherent and strategic policy in the Middle East. ISIL has a 10-year track record both in Iraq and in Syria, but the question we should ask is, how has it become so strong? Jane's assessment of world insurgency and terrorism says that ISIL was funded from the very countries with whom we now propose to ally ourselves: Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Kuwait, whose refusal to put in place any serious financial controls has seen hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned off to ISIL and other jihadists. What pressure did the UK government put on those governments to tighten the noose around that flow of funds? Did we talk about sanctions or freezing accounts in London? Of course not. This government was too busy trying to clinch the £4.4 billion deal for the 72 Eurofighter Typhoon jets to Saudi Arabia. This was our government's priority. It should have been otherwise. So now that ISIL are regarded by their former paymasters as too big for their boots, we are joining forces with them to degrade ISIL's capacity and cut them back down to size. But we're told there's no intention of boots on the ground. What a reassurance that is. Of course there will be no boots on the ground. The Sunni states in the Middle East don't want to destroy ISIL. They want it to remain as a thorn in the flesh of the Iraqi government. This government is not America's poodle. It is the poodle of the Sunni states. Britain could have exerted real influence on the Maliki government, but we turned a blind eye as the Iraqi government ruled as faction and thug. Where was our government's attention? It was on Syria. But who did we want to degrade there? It wasn't ISIL. It was, of course, Bashar al-Assad. This government has made foolish alliances and alienated countries like Russia that could have helped. It has been pathetically weak in bringing our so-called friends to book, and it's deluding itself, or worse, the public, by any suggestion that airstrikes against ISIL are a sufficient response to the wider hell that is the Sunni-Shia conflict. So 3 questions. What demands and what potential sanctions has the UK placed upon Prime Minister al-Abadi about inclusive government in Iraq as a precondition of our involvement? What assessment has the government made of the warning from the Royal United Services Institute that limited airstrikes could serve to further legitimise ISIS? And finally, what demands has the UK placed on Saudi Arabia and other Sunni states about cutting off funding from Wahhabist jihadi groups around the globe? The Prime Minister says we're fighting for democratic values, but these are not democracies we're fighting with. In joining with them, it's not democracy we're protecting. These are the last absolute theocratic monarchies on the planet, and we support them at our peril.
1-minute thesis from Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Two small points in 1 minute. First, I'd like to pay tribute to our armed forces. It looks as if tonight they'll be once again put at the front line and in harm's way. The few who've become fewer will once again be flying over enemy skies. Our thoughts will be with them and their families, and God forbid they're shot down, those who have to go and pick them up off the sand. It's not just the pilots that are going to be involved. Secondly, ISIL, there's no doubt in my view, is a risk to the stability of the Middle East. It's certainly therefore a risk to the future of world stability. That affects us and our future security. There's no doubt in my view that we should get involved, and we cannot wash our hands and just walk away on this occasion. I will be supporting the motion tonight, and I'm grateful personally to the Prime Minister for allowing us to debate this today and calling us back here to debate nothing that really is as important for us, taking our country, regrettably, once more to war.
Mr. Douglas Alexander.
Mr. Speaker, the tone, content and contributions in this debate have done justice to the seriousness of the motion before the House today. We have heard contributions by former Defence Secretaries, former personnel from our armed forces and a range of other very distinguished voices. Now, given the limited time available, however, I hope the House will forgive me if I do not acknowledge individually the full breadth of important contributions that we have heard over the last 6 hours. As the Leader of the Opposition has already made clear, we will support the government in the lobby this afternoon. For many of us, to be deciding on the use of British military force in Iraq is a wrenching decision. As the opposition, we do this not because we are eager for conflict, nor because we are unaware of recent history, nor simply because we wish to show support for our armed forces. We do so because we believe this action meets the criteria that have been set down by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, that this is a just cause, that the proposed action is a last resort, that it is proportional, that it has a reasonable prospect of success, that it has a clear legal base, and that it has broad regional support. I trust all sides of this House will be united in its wholehearted support for those men and women who will take part in this perilous action with their characteristic skill, courage and devotion to duty. But this House is a parliament of women and men of free will and independent judgment. There are real worries, anxieties and concerns in all parts of the House, and they must be listened to and responded to with respect. The government motion accordingly makes clear that it is seeking authority to act in Iraq, and that a separate parliamentary vote would be required for any military action proposed in Syria. While, as the opposition, we support the action taken by the Americans and the air forces of 5 Arab nations this week in Syria, we believe that holding such a separate vote, if action in Syria is contemplated, is the right course of action. All of us are aware that the question of international military intervention in Syria over recent years has been a subject of international controversy. All of us know that legitimacy matters to the effectiveness of such missions. All of us know that Syria is experiencing a multi-layered, multifaceted civil war. Yet the issue of who could conduct ground operations in Syria at this time, however, remains wholly unclear as this debate concludes. And as this debate concludes, there still remains no real clarity about the wider political strategy for transition in Syria. Our mind is not closed, and we have not made agreement of a Security Council resolution a condition for considering future action. But given the history of recent military interventions, the British people both want and deserve a cautious, considered and calibrated approach when military action is contemplated. The government motion, I will give way.
Just set out the position about the UN Security Council resolution. If such a resolution is tabled and it is vetoed, what would be the position of the Labour Party in intervention in Syria?
As I've just sought to explain to the right honourable gentleman, our moral compass is not set in Moscow or Beijing. We think it would be better to have the world's principal multilateral forum, the United Nations, consider this matter. But we have said very clearly that there is a legal basis for action. That is the basis on which we've provided support both to the 5 Arab nations and indeed to the American action that we've seen in Syria in recent days. But as I sought to reflect in my remarks, there is an issue of legality and there is an issue of legitimacy. And given the controversy that has surrounded international action in Syria in recent years, we think any actions that can secure broader legitimacy would be assistance in the completion of that mission. Let me seek to make a little progress. The government motion also makes clear that it will not deploy UK troops in ground combat operations in Iraq. Not only is there little or no public or parliamentary support for such action, it would risk many of the same cruel frustrations of the last difficult and painful mission in Iraq. Just as fundamentally, however, UK combat troops in ground operations would undermine an essential point that needs to be made again and again to the Iraqi government and to the Iraqi people. This has to be your fight. We, the international community, cannot win this battle for you. Let me turn directly to the adversaries identified by the motion. ISIL's callousness and barbarism, including the taking and murdering of British hostages, has been well rehearsed in this debate. So too has their expansionary ambition to establish a caliphate at the heart of the Middle East. So let no one here suggest that we are now engaged in a conflict with Islamic State. As the Secretary-General of the United Nations observed rightly earlier this week, they should more fittingly be called un-Islamic non-state, because no faith, no God condones or justifies their barbarism. We are not and never will be in conflict with Islam. Islam teaches peace. And when millions of our fellow British citizens of Muslim faith are woven into the very fabric of our communities and our country, let us resolve individually and collectively to extend a hand of solidarity and friendship to our British brothers and sisters who follow the Muslim faith. So it is also vital that the government steps up its counter-radicalisation work, as my right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, has repeatedly urged at this dispatch box. And every effort must be made by our brave and dedicated security services to identify, monitor and respond effectively to the threat posed by radicalised British citizens returning to the UK from the region. As the contribution of a number of members has reflected, the fight against ISIL is at its core a struggle about the future of Sunni Arabs. So it is crucial that Sunni governments have offered not only support, but are participating in this multilateral mission. Only Sunni participation stands a chance of convincing ordinary Arabs and Sunnis in Iraq that the fight with ISIL is also their fight. Yet, as many honourable members have recognised, such wars are not won through air power alone. ISIL cannot be defeated without someone to replace it on the ground. Notwithstanding the capabilities of the Peshmerga, that will take time given the current condition of the Iraqi security forces. Nor would it be acceptable or desirable for the Shia militia, who have played an important role in halting ISIL's advance on Baghdad, to play a central role in liberating predominantly Sunni cities. Airstrikes are essential, however, to stem ISIL's advance and to degrade its operations. But we should be clear that this objective of disrupting, degrading and weakening ISIL must be in the service of creating the conditions for new forms of governance in Sunni parts of Iraq. Maliki's sectarian rule was not only disastrous for the Iraqi armed forces, but also for Iraqi society. So Iraq now needs to rebuild its armed forces in ways that reflect the need to restore confidence amongst its Sunni population. It still has a long way to go on this path. But this military action must be underpinned by a clear political strategy, and it is vital that Iraqis themselves drain the sectarian impulses that sustain ISIL in Sunni areas of Iraq today. So the commencement of military action must not be a signal that the time for diplomatic, humanitarian and political action is over. This challenge will test not just our military strength, but diplomatic and political skills and stamina as well, challenging, yes, traditional allies in the Gulf, as well as engaging with other countries in the region, such as Iran. This House has the privilege of discussion, but also the responsibility of decision. And all of us who will support and stand with the government today must also have the humility to acknowledge that in this moment we cannot say with certainty all that lies ahead. Even limited military intervention brings with it unforeseen and uncertain consequences. But by our decision today, we will be supporting action to prevent the foreseeable and certain killing of Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Christian and Yazidi Iraqis by ISIL. We will be supporting action that has broad support in the region and follows a direct request from a democratically elected government of Iraq. We have a legal, political and moral mandate to act to resist ISIL in Iraq. That is the international community's responsibility. That should be Britain's choice, and so that must be the House's decision. I urge all members to support the motion tonight.
Call the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Nick Clegg.
Mr Speaker, this 6-hour debate has been at all times thoughtful, respectful and sober on an issue of great significance and great complexity as well. I want to address, if I can, in the time remaining, those who've spoken out worrying that we are doing too much and possibly repeating the mistakes of the past, those who conversely feel we might be doing too little and should be going further or are embarking upon a piecemeal strategy, and then thirdly, really underlining the significance of those voices on all sides of the House who've spoken, if I will in a minute, who've spoken out so emphatically against those who might interpret this as a conflict of religions, as a West versus the rest. But before I give way, I would like to join the Right Honourable Member for Salford and Eccles and others who stood in solidarity and spoke out in support for the family and loved ones of Alan Henning and John Cantley. It is unimaginable what anguish they must be going through as well. And also I'd like to join the Honourable Member for South Dorset, Right Honourable Member for Mid Sussex, Right Honourable Member for Belfast North and others who also said how important it is that we bear in mind the great courage and professionalism of our service men and women who are once again being asked to put themselves into danger's way for our collective safety. I give way.
Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, does he agree with the stance of the Prime Minister that he supports the policy of not coming back to this House for approval for further action, whether against Syria or boots on the ground?
What the Prime Minister said, which I think every reasonable person would accept, is that if any government at any point finds that it needs to act very, very quickly indeed to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe or to protect British citizens here or abroad, clearly the government of the day has the right. There may be circumstances in which action is needed needs to be taken in a matter of hours or overnight. I will give way in a minute, but if I could just say for those, and I felt that the Right Honourable Member for Wolverhampton South East spoke very articulately on this, for those who worry about the echoes of the debate that was had about Iraq in 2003, of course we should avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, but that does not mean we should be trapped by the past. Of course we should learn from the past, but not be paralysed by it. And I would say to all of those, such as myself, who campaigned against an attack on Iraq in 2003, I do not, and I think many others do not, hesitate in now advocating that we should act to defend Iraq upon a request from the Iraqi government, the legitimate Iraqi government today. I give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Had I been able to speak in the debate, I would have asked him if he could reassure the House tonight by exactly what criteria His Majesty's government will judge when ISIL have been sufficiently degraded so that they no longer pose a military threat.
I think the point at which ISIL no longer can act with the menace and the brutality that it does at the moment will be quite obvious on the ground. But as many people have pointed out, we are not pretending, and no one should, that airstrikes on their own are the solution. And that is why I would like to address myself to those who have suggested, the Right Honourable Member for Croydon South, Right Honourable Member for Neath, the Right Honourable Member for Sheffield Heeley, the Right Honourable Member for North Somerset and Sutton Coldfield and others, that we should now take the decision to also embark upon airstrikes in Syria. It's important to remember there are, as the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield and others have pointed out, there are complexities in Syria which are not present in Iraq. There are differences. Because we are not embarking upon airstrikes in Syria does not mean we are, I will in a minute, does not mean we are inactive in Syria. We train, equip and advise those forces in Syria who we wish to support in Syria. And in one sense, by choosing to play one part in the wider jigsaw of this coalition effort that is now assembling 60 nations undertaking different forms of action, military, diplomatic, political and humanitarian, we are saying quite overtly that we are doing one part of what we judge we can do best right now, but not pretending that we can do everything all at once. Just because you can't do everything does surely not mean that you do nothing, and that is the sensible stance that we are taking.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, but may I ask him, we've had a great deal about the RAF and their role they're going to play, but can I ask him as to what role the Royal Navy is going to play, especially our submarine fleet as well?
Quite right.
Mr. Speaker, clearly all our assets are available, and as you will know, the Ministry of Defence has Tomahawk-capable submarines that are available, and the Royal Navy has several vessels in the Persian Gulf. But may I also just compliment the very thoughtful interventions by the honourable members for Penrith and Borders and Stratford-on-Avon, who quite rightly highlighted the fact that any military action can only seek to create the conditions in which a diplomatic and political process can take hold. All we can seek to do is work with other countries in an effort led by Arab nations in the region in order to create the conditions in which good governance can take root in both Iraq and Syria. And as the Prime Minister said, at the end of the day, bombs can kill terrorists, as Ban Ki-moon said, but good governance is what kills terrorism.
I'm very grateful to the Deputy Prime Minister for giving way. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that there would be concern if we abrogated responsibility in connection with Syria, potential punitive action in future with Syria, if we abrogated it completely to the United Nations Security Council, because that would be tantamount to leaving it to Vladimir Putin to consent or deny?
As I say, that is not the subject of the debate today, and clearly the United Nations always plays a role in these things. The United Nations Security Council has already pronounced against ISIL over the last several weeks, but the conditions certainly now were neither available nor legally necessary for a Chapter 7 resolution to be passed. Can I pass now to something which I felt came through in the debate on all sides of the House, was a very strong feeling on all sides of the House, and I must say I'm sure I was not alone in thinking that the Honourable Member for Birmingham, Lady Ladywood, she's not here now, spoke out as someone of the Sunni Muslim faith herself in saying that Islamic State is neither Islamic, as the Right Honourable Gentleman has just said, nor a state, that the greatest antidote to their perversion of Islam are moderate, peace-loving Muslim communities elsewhere and in this country. And that is why it is so important, as the Honourable Member for Stourbridge said, as the Right Honourable Member for Salford and Eccles said, as the Right Honourable for Chesham and Amersham put it very powerfully, the Honourable Member for Gloucester, is that we must work very closely together with all those individuals, families, community organisations, religious leaders who've spoken out with great courage at a time of rising Islamophobia and increasing anxiety in many Muslim communities here and elsewhere, have spoken out with the strength of feeling that they have that ISIL is as much of a potent threat to their way of life and their religion as it is to anybody else's. I give way.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for giving way. We've heard a lot about failed military interventions in this part of the world today, but would he agree one successful military intervention in this part of the world was the no-fly zone over northern Iraq in the 1990s that allowed the Kurdistan region to flourish as a democratic, prosperous and religiously tolerant part of the world? I met Kurdish students at Huddersfield University during the summer. As well as responding to Iraq, let's respond to the Kurds. Does he agree?
Well, he's of course entirely right. My old friend, of course, is entirely right to say that we as a country played a role in that. That allowed as I said earlier, that allowed the space for the Kurdish authorities to find their own feet, metaphorically speaking, and to decide their own fate. And of course, the assistance we're giving, both in terms of lethal equipment, advice, training, and also the long-standing partnership we have with the Kurdish authorities, will play an extraordinarily important role in Iraq. Combined, of course, with the work we must do with the Iraqi army to make sure as we deliver airstrikes, as will other members of the coalition. Denmark, for instance, while this debate has been held today, have also announced that they will be taking a similar route, that at the same time, on the ground, the Kurdish authorities, the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army will be able to push hard against ISIL on the ground as well. I give way.
I thank him for giving way. The language around airstrikes sound very clean and precise, but we know that in reality they are anything but. Does he genuinely believe that all other measures, political and diplomatic, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, have properly been pursued before we go down this action of yet more bombing? And does he accept that those of us who think that actually the alternative to bombing is not doing nothing, but it's the redoubled diplomatic and political efforts that we need, that we have not seen, that is what should be at the centre of this debate?
I think whilst I regret it, and everybody on all sides of the House may regret this, there are times when it is simply impossible to reason with your foe. There is no diplomatic initiative which would be recognised by ISIL. This is a barbaric, murderous outfit which by their actions and their pronouncements have shown they cannot be reasoned with. And as for her suggestion that this is precipitate action, I completely reject that. For week after week after week, I think great restraint has been shown, most especially by President Obama, who's been under considerable political pressure to act more precipitately, and he has said, sensibly, as have we, no, a coalition of now 60 nations must first be assembled. Countries from the region must play an active role, as they are. We need to receive a request from the government itself, the Iraqi government, a Muslim government, as we have done. We must discuss this at NATO, as we have done. We must discuss this at the United Nations, as we have done. I don't think anyone could reasonably accuse this House, this government, or the international coalition of acting precipitately at all.
To the Deputy Prime Minister, but wouldn't he agree that it would have been preferable to have a UN resolution?
Of course it would be preferable, but as the former Attorney General, the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield, has pointed out, given the legal clarity of which serves as the basis for our actions, namely the request from a sovereign government, from a legitimate government, to the Iraqi government, it does not make that UN resolution necessary. And also, it was equally been made clear that there are other members of the Security Council who simply were not prepared to allow for a Chapter 7 resolution to proceed. I'll make way and then I must make progress.
Grateful. Given that there are many in this House who have very strong concerns about this, I myself will vote for tonight's motion, but with a very heavy heart. Will the Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister commit to coming back to this House very regularly, particularly early in October when we return, to make statements to the House to keep us appraised of what's going on and what further measures are needed?
Of course we undertake to provide regular updates to the House. And by the way, I think the feeling with which he describes his own sentiments with a heavy heart is one that I think everybody shares. There is nothing other than great seriousness around this issue, and that I think is the tone in which it has been dealt with during these last 6 hours of debate. Finally, I would like to echo those who said that at the end of the day, this is also something which speaks to our values. We believe on all sides of this House in intolerance. ISIL believes in hate. We believe in coexistence. They believe in division. We believe in freedom of speech. They believe in the tyranny of thought. And that is why I urge the House to support the motion today. We must act. We do so mindful of the mistakes and lessons of the past, but we do so with lawful authority, with clear objectives, and with the support and active participation of a broad coalition of international opinion, which is saying to ISIL, enough is enough. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I commend this motion to the House.
Order. The question is the motion on Iraq, coalition against ISIL, as on the order paper. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Aye. Order. The question is the motion on Iraq, coalition against ISIL, as on the order papers. Many other opinions say aye. Of the contrary, no. Tell us for the ayes, Mr. Mark Hunter, Mr. Gavin Barwell. Tell us for the noes, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn and Mr. Pete Wishart. Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 524. The noes to the left, 43.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 524. The noes to the left, 43. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House...
Just a point of order, Mr. John MacDonald.
The Prime Minister has informed us that he will take action without parliamentary authority if he feels it necessary. Can I place on record an appeal to you, Mr. Speaker, that if there is any indication of further action beyond the remit of this motion, that you consider yourself to be able to have the power to convene this House?
I'm guided by and must operate within the standing orders of the House. I am not, under the standing orders of the House, so empowered. However, for the time being, and I say this in the best possible spirit, I will simply note that the honourable gentleman has expressed his own view with his customary force. It is on the record. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
Yeah, well.